There is a clay tablet in the British Museum, not a monument, not a relief carved for kings, just fired clay pressed with a reed stylus sometime around 2004 BCE. It records a collapse, a city of tens of thousands emptied over weeks of siege and famine. A king walked away in chains to Elam and was never recorded again, and a force the scribe could only name an evil wind, something that moved like fire, that silenced everything it passed through, that no military account written afterward fully explains. The tablet is still there, the phrase is still in it. We can read it. We cannot read what it cost to write. The city of had been the administrative capital of southern Mesopotamia for roughly a century before the end came. Ur-Nammu, the king who built it into an empire around 2112 BCE, had not simply conquered territory, he had organized it. His scribes developed one of the earliest known law codes in human history, predating Hammurabi by 3 centuries. His engineers raised the great ziggurat of a stepped temple platform of fired brick and bitumen whose foundations still stand in southern Iraq today. The city at its height may have contained as many as 65,000 residents, larger than most contemporary European cities would be for another 2 millennia. I found the administrative records while tracing something else, the architectural proportions of III temple complexes, trying to understand a discrepancy in the measurement systems used before and after the collapse. But the deeper I went into the archive, the more I realized the buildings were not the real story. The people were. Because what the tablets preserve is not just the record of a civilization, it is the record of a civilization in the act of failing, documented line by line, allocation by allocation until the line simply stops. This is exactly what makes the silence so legible. Ur-Nammu's achievement was not military in the conventional sense, it was bureaucratic. Every worker in the Ur-3 system received a ration allocation, barley, oil, wool, recorded on clay tablets in quantities precise to the fraction. Every field yielded a documented harvest. Every ox, every bolt of cloth, every measure of grain passed through an accounting system so detailed that modern archaeologists can reconstruct individual supply chains from what survives. The Ur-3 Administrative Archive represents one of the largest collections of cuneiform tablets ever recovered. Tens of thousands of documents from a single century of governance, filed in storerooms across the empire and preserved when those storerooms collapsed and buried them. Ibbi-Sin, the 5th and final king of the Ur-3 line, came to power around 2028 BCE and inherited a system that still functioned, barely. Amorite migrations were pressing from the northwest. Trade routes that had carried timber and metals into the treeless southern plain were increasingly disrupted. But the decisive blow did not come from outside the empire's walls. It came from within it. A man named Ishbi-Erra, a military official appointed to secure emergency grain supplies from the northern city of Isin, wrote to Ibbi-Sin in a letter that archaeologists recovered and translated. The roads were no longer safe, Ishbi-Erra reported. The grain was in Isin, but transporting it required resources the capital could not provide. He requested authority to hold the supplies temporarily. Ibbi-Sin granted it. Ishbi-Erra never sent the grain back. He declared himself king of Isin and began absorbing the northern cities that had been loyal to Ur. He had found the right moment. He recognized it immediately. He took it. The defections followed a pattern that the administrative archive traces in reverse, not in the records that survive, but in the records that stop. Nippur, the religious center of Mesopotamia whose symbolic allegiance was essential to any king claiming legitimacy, transferred its loyalty to Ishbi-Erra within a few years. Eshnunna followed. Lagash. Each city that had been integrated into the Ur-3 supply network began operating independently, cutting the routes that fed the capital. Each decision was rational in isolation. Together they formed a siege that required no army to initiate. By the final years of Ibbi-Sin's reign, the grain allocation texts from Ur had thinned to intermittency and then to absence. Not a dramatic cessation, a slow fade. the way an institution registers its own collapse, not in the documents it produces about the crisis, but in the ordinary documents it stops producing altogether. The correspondence that survives from Ibbi-Sin himself has a register his predecessors never used. A letter to a local official describes the enemy entering deep into the land, cities destroyed, conditions beyond what words can hold. The king of the last Sumerian empire was writing in the language of desperation. The scribe who recorded these years was not one person. He was a professional class, trained from childhood in the aduba, the tablet house, to press signs into wet clay with the precise angle that distinguished one meaning from another. He had copied legal codes and hymns to Inanna, and lists of medicinal plants and accounts of harvests stretching back generations. He understood, in the way that training instills understanding, that the tablet outlasted the event. The institution that trained him had survived drought and political upheaval for a century. It had never prepared him for the possibility that the institution itself might not survive. In those final months, the ziggurat's shadow still fell across the city each morning. The canals still moved, though with less water than before. The storehouses that had once distributed grain to tens of thousands stood with their allocations uncompleted, their records thinning towards silence. And somewhere beyond the eastern horizon, from the direction of Elam, something was already moving toward that the administrative vocabulary of the entire III scribal tradition had no existing category to record. Kindatu of Elam did not arrive alone. The coalition that destroyed around 2004 BCE included Elamite forces and allied peoples who had pressed against the edges of Ibbi-Sin's kingdom for years, waiting for the moment when contained fewer defenders than the surrounding territory contained enemies. When the siege became a breach, the city that had administered grain allocations for 65,000 people, that had maintained astronomical records and legal codes for a century, fell within a span of time the archive does not record, because by then there was no one left to maintain it. What we have instead is the Lament. The lament for the destruction of the lament for Urim in the Sumerian, was composed by temple scribes within a generation of the collapse, intended for public performance as a formal document of grief. What it records is not troop movements or siege tactics, but what the city experienced from the inside, not what happened to it strategically, but what it felt like when it ended. And the language those scribes reached for, in the oldest surviving urban lament in recorded history, was not the language of invasion, it was the language of weather. The lament records a storm that annihilates the land. It records fire raging and consuming everything. It records darkness, not night, but something imposed, something that arrived over the city as a condition. It records heat. It records weapons in the streets, but alongside them, a force that moved through the city and left silence where tens of thousands had lived. Enlil blew an evil storm, the lament states, and silence lay upon the city. The storehouses were blocked, the waterways were blocked. The people who remained were not described as having fallen to named enemies in named engagements. They were described as having been overtaken by something that moved through the air faster than a response could be organized, that the scribes named but could not explain beyond its effects. Scholars of the Sumerian lament tradition note that this imagery was conventional. Storm, divine abandonment, darkness, consuming heat, these were the established poetic vocabulary for catastrophe in ancient Mesopotamia. When a city fell, its gods were said to have departed. When its people perished, an evil wind was said to have passed. This is the most defensible reading, and it accounts for most of what the lament contains. Reasonable except for one detail. Thorkild Jacobsen and Samuel Noah Kramer, whose foundational translations shaped the field across the 20th century, both noted that the density of the destruction imagery in the Urim lament exceeds what appears in comparable texts for other fallen Mesopotamian cities. The combination is unusual: blocked waterways, blocked food supplies, darkened sky, heat, mass death. The text does not attribute to visible swords, but to the passage of something through the air, and a silence that descended over the city as an ending. Each element individually fits the established poetic form. Together, they describe something that researchers working outside mainstream Assyriology have found difficult to dismiss as convention alone. The comparisons are uncomfortable. The Mahabharata contains descriptions of weapons that release fire, produce unnatural darkness, cause hair loss among survivors, and poison water sources for years afterward. The destruction of Sodom in Genesis arrives as fire from the sky, consuming heat and instantaneous death among people not in the path of any conventional weapon. In 1908, a small extraterrestrial object detonating at low altitude over Tunguska, Siberia, flattened approximately 2,000 square kilometers of forest, generated a shock wave felt hundreds of kilometers away, set trees ablaze across an area larger than many cities, and left no crater, because it detonated in the air before reaching the ground. People 60 kilometers from the center were knocked from their feet. No enemy was visible. The force had moved through the atmosphere. A similar event over a dense urban settlement would produce silence. It would produce heat. It would block waterways with debris. It would kill people who bore no wounds from any named weapon because the force had moved through the air. To a scribe pressing reed into wet clay in the hours after, the only category available for something that travelled through the sky and destroyed everything beneath it was divine wind, an evil storm from Enlil, the god of air and storms, because wind was the only word his language had built for invisible forces that consumed what they touched. That interpretation has never been proven. It has also never been disproven. What happened to Ibbi-Sin carries no ambiguity. He was taken captive by the Elamites and transported east into Elam, where he disappears from the historical record entirely. No death date, no account of captivity. He walked out of and out of history at the same moment. The city he left behind did not reconstitute its administrative class. The scribal institution that had maintained grain allocations, astronomical records, and legal texts for more than a century did not survive to the other side. Something had passed through The city that remained was not the city that had existed before. The scribe who pressed evil wind into wet clay was not choosing between accuracy and metaphor. He was reaching for the most precise language his training had given him, a language built for recording grain shipments, legal decisions, astronomical cycles, and hymns to Inanna, a language with no technical vocabulary for an event that moved through the air faster than a person could run, that darkened the sky, that left silence where tens of thousands had lived. Evil wind was not evasion. It was the closest his language could come to what had happened. The Sumerian lament tradition operated through inherited conventions, and the scribes who composed the lament for Urim worked within a genre they had copied and studied the way they copied everything else their institution required. But the events they recorded had exceeded the form's original scope. What pressed through the convention, the specific clustering of blocked waterways, blocked storehouses, darkened sky, heat, silence, death that arrived before any named enemy had been identified, survived in the text because the text survived. Clay does not burn the way papyrus burns. Clay does not decay the way organic memory decays. The tablet was always more durable than the event it held. The lament for Urim was composed within living memory of the collapse. Within a generation of 2004 BCE, scribes who had either witnessed the end of Ur-3 directly or received their account from those who had, set down in formal Sumerian what the city had experienced and what the gods had permitted to occur. The text was intended for public performance, a communal document of grief, read aloud in whatever institutional form survived the fall. It was not private record. It was written to be recognized as accurate by an audience that had been present. The language the composers chose was language that audience would have confirmed: an evil wind, a storm that annihilated, fire that consumed, silence where the city had been. Those tablets were buried, not deliberately archived, not hidden in any institution that survived to catalogue them, simply buried under 4,000 years of sediment in the floodplain of the Euphrates. In the 19th and early 20th centuries, excavators began working the mounds of southern Iraq and recovering what lay beneath. Leonard Woolley's excavations at Ur, conducted jointly by the British Museum and the University of Pennsylvania between 1922 and 1934, uncovered the physical remains of what Ibbi-Sin had lost: the great ziggurat, still partially standing, the royal cemetery, thousands of tablets, some still in the rooms where the last scribes had placed them before the end. The human chain from that scribe to us is, by the standards of ancient history, unusually short and unusually intact. The tablets survived, the language is deciphered, the text is searchable. The Lament for Urim is published in full translation and transliteration by the Electronic Text Corpus of Sumerian Literature at the University of Oxford. Anyone can read the phrase. The phrase has not moved. The full timeline reads this way. Ur-Nammu builds the empire around 2112 BCE. The ziggurat rises, the law code is written, the grain allocations begin, a century passes. Ibbi-Sin inherits a kingdom thinning at its edges. Ishbi-Erra takes the grain and declares himself king of Isin. Nippur defects, Eshnunna defects, Lagash defects. The administrative texts thin to intermittency and then to silence. The correspondence from Ibbi-Sin grows desperate. Kindatu's forces arrive from Elam. The city falls. Ibbi-Sin walks east into captivity and disappears from every surviving record. Something passes through Ur. The Lament calls it an evil wind. And the city on the other side is not the city that existed before. The scribes compose the Lament within a generation. The tablets are pressed, dried, and eventually buried. Woolley's team finds them in the 1920s. Kramer translates them in the 1940s. The phrase is still in the text. There was a last scribe. There had to have been a man trained from childhood in the Edubba who understood that the tablet outlasted everything, who pressed a reed into wet clay in a city that had already gone quiet and fallen silent around him, and wrote the only words his language had for what he had witnessed and what he could not name with any greater precision. He did not know whether anyone would ever read it. He could not have known the tablet would outlast the city, the empire, the language, and 4,000 years of silence before an archaeologist's brush uncovered it in the southern Iraqi floodplain. He wrote it anyway. Writing was what he knew how to do. The tablet is in the museum, the phrase is still in the text. We can read it today in translation and in the original Sumerian on a screen within seconds from anywhere on Earth. We cannot read what it cost to write it. We cannot read what the hand that pressed it into clay had witnessed in the hours before. The archive is patient. It has been waiting in the same way it has always been waiting for someone willing to ask what the last witnesses actually recorded, instead of deciding in advance what their words should have meant.